My name is Sarah Mansour. I'm a research assistant at the Jean Monnet Network for Transatlantic Trade Politics, and this is part of a series of interviews for the network called the Transatlantic Trade Videos. We're here today with Gabriel Siles-Brügge, who is an associate professor of public policy and the director of graduate studies in the Department of Politics and International Studies at the University of Warwick in the UK. Welcome, Professor Siles-Brügge, and thank you for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thank you for having me, Sarah.
Alrighty, so our first question. In a recent article of yours, you discussed the role that expert knowledge has played in legitimizing various options for the UK's post-Brexit trade policy, such as hard and soft Brexit. So how would you describe your main findings?
Well, I think, one of the biggest debates to emerge in the UK after the referendum has been over what trade policy the UK should pursue post-Brexit vis-a-vis both the EU and third countries. And broadly, what you've had is supporters of a soft Brexit, which have been pushing for the UK to remain aligned with the EU's single market and its customs union, while, opposed to them you've had advocates of hard Brexit who have been pushing for the UK to effectively break free of the EU's economic space so that the UK can pursue ambitious trade agreements with third parties. Now, advocates of soft Brexit were quick to accuse those that have been pushing for a hard Brexit that their views were not grounded in economic evidence. And prominent in the discursive armory of those pushing for a soft Brexit has been a recourse to what are called so-called gravity models of trade, which are premised on the idea, like gravity, that bigger and more proximate countries trade more with each other. And so the argument was, drawing on the economic evidence provided by these models, that it was a folly to abandon a large integrated single market on the UK's doorstep. Obviously in this context of the vote for Brexit, but also the vote for Donald Trump, there's been a lot of talk of post-truth politics. And arguably, the advocates of a soft Brexit have said, well, in the face of this economic evidence, those are advocating for a hard Brexit are really operating in the domain of post-truth politics. But what I tried to show in the article is that actually advocates of a hard Brexit have turned to expertise as well, but of a different kind. And specifically in the article, I was talking about the role played by a series of experts working or associated with the Lodron Institute and later the Institute for Economic Affairs that have been particularly influential with certain policymakers. And their argument is premised on a particular reading of WTO texts, emphasizing that actually the UK doesn't stand to lose much in terms of regulatory disalignment from the EU because of provisions in the WTO texts around mutual recognition and equivalence. And they've also emphasized the benefits of the UK of aligning its or pursuing trade agreements with so-called like-minded countries in the Anglosphere, which would allow them to tackle so-called anti-competitive distortions of the kind found, for example, in the EU's food safety regulations or data protection standards. Now, in the article, I'm of course not suggesting that these types of expertise are necessarily equivalent, right? I'm not, while I would be critical, I think, of the exact figures generated by econometric modeling. I think it's, the basic premise kind of makes sense, right? If you're a bigger country closer and you're closer together, then, you're likely to trade more with one another. And similarly, I think the reading offered here by the Legatum IEA experts of WTO text is potentially problematic. But rather, what the paper was trying to do is show how these different types of expertise were really emotionally grounded. And while the arguments around, trading with the EU or the benefits of trading with the EU that were being made premised in econometric modelings were quite, dry, technical, not particularly emotionally resonant, the whole, discourse around trading with the Anglosphere and like-minded countries I think played on and was well received, of course, amongst a particular constituency within the Conservative Party, that had been pushing for a hard Brexit, right? So I think this was the argument, that effectively, A, there were different types of expertise floating around, and it wasn't just a case of hard Brexiters not using experts, and secondly, that, actually their kind of expertise in some ways had an advantage because, it was much more emotionally resonant.
Okay. So, do you think that expert knowledge was under or overused to legitimize the future direction of the UK's trade policy?
I mean, I don't think it's so much a question of whether expertise is under or overutilized, but rather the way that expertise figures in the political debate. And so it's important to note that in the run-up to the vote for Brexit, but also the vote for Donald Trump, and this pertains not just to the UK political context, but I think to trade policy making more, in a global context. I think there was a tendency to rely a lot on legal and economic expertise as a way of shutting down the debate on trade policy and making it a purely technical matter. So if you were an opponent, let's say, of further trade liberalization, you were confronted with economic arguments, often drawing on particular econometric models about the benefits of trade liberalization, or you were presented with legal arguments talking about, the sort of, legal rules around non-discrimination that exist in trade agreements, including, agreements associated with the WTO. And, effectively, that kind of shuts down the debate and I think, frustrates the possibility for a constructive debate and reduces expertise to something, unassailable in a sense. And that's partly the problem, with what the Remain side did during the referendum, invoking very economistic arguments that didn't have, that sort of emotive resonance. And of course, what that allowed is, the pro-Leave side to delegitimize this particular form of expert opinion, but premised on very economistic arguments, but also relativize it by bringing in their own experts. So Ben Rosamond has also written about this, and he's written about alternative experts and alternative forms of knowledge being deployed. And so what I would say is that I think expertise has a really important role to play in policy making. And of course, not all expertise is equally valid. I'm not trying to make a relativistic point here, but that doesn't mean that we should be treating it as the gospel or just seeing it as one more sort of discourse in the mix. So I think the right approach kind of lies in between. Where obviously experts are seen as knowledgeable figures, but they're still open to questioning and challenging, and their expertise should feed, I think, into an open and deliberative policy process.
Okay, so how would taking into account the emotional basis of expert knowledge change the discourse on the matter?
Well, I think recognizing that expert knowledge is inherently political and normative, and underpinned by an appeal to different types of emotional response, whether that's, in this case, a repression of emotion, if we're talking about, very economistic arguments, or we're talking about an appeal to, the sort of, likes of, or an appeal to kith and kin in English-speaking countries, when we're talking about expertise that is all about promoting UK trade policy with those countries. I think that might make for a healthier sort of relationship to expertise in public discourse on trade policy. And actually, I think what that would allow is for trade policy to, or discussions around trade policy to focus much more on, what kind of public purposes, it should serve in public discourse, rather than just assuming that, more trade is better, or that we should just be trading with, countries that, we're supposedly culturally or politically close to.
Okay. So can you elaborate on how better democratic deliberation can be achieved if policymakers and politicians discuss their underlying value systems more openly? And what would an open discussion of value systems look like for the UK?
So, I think being more open about underlying value systems in the context of the UK's trade policy would mean seeing, or moving beyond seeing trade policy as just a technical exercise about regulating the movement of goods and services across borders, and thinking about, as I said earlier, the broader socioeconomic purpose that trade policy serves. So, for example, rather than talking about EU membership exclusively in terms of the sort of great benefits to growth and jobs that come from liberalized trade with EU member states, which is effectively this sort of argument that the Remain side has made, and those and subsequently advocates of soft Brexit. I think there needs to, or there should have been, or needs to be, and this is a longer process, a recognition of the broader political community that European integration represents, and also a recognition, and this is perhaps more specific to trade policy, of the wider social purpose that, for example, single market regulation plays. So, the common rules that exist in the single market are not just there to facilitate movement of goods across borders, although of course that's one of the political objectives, but actually they're there also to achieve objectives like protecting the environment or public health. So I think that would be a first stepping stone. And similarly, I think and this was another point I was making in the paper, by focusing on questions of values, I think we can drill into and expose some of the motivations of supporters of hard Brexit, and go beyond, I think, the talk that exists in public discourse around trading with the Anglosphere, because a lot of these Brexit supporters actually have quite a Thatcherite commitment to deregulation, which I think is often captured by the idea of creating a sort of Singapore on Thames. And so Michael Keddy, Nick Pearce, for example, have argued in a recent book, and I quote, that a neo-Thatcherite idea of Brexit has been rendered considerably more palatable when presented through the narrative and ethos of the English-speaking peoples. So, effectively, by being much more open about values, I think, we can challenge, I think, those sorts of political projects. I guess this is the maybe more normative side of the paper.
Right. So, turning from Brexit to political contestation about trade policy more generally, your work has also discussed the increased collaboration between municipal governmental actors and social movement organizations in order to contest global trade governance. So how was this collaboration made possible, and was it successful in achieving its goal?
So this is work I've done together with Michael Strange at the University of Malmö in Sweden, and what we've been researching is a phenomenon which we've called municipal level trade contestation. And what we've seen is that over the course of several trade investment negotiations, notably those concerned with the Multilateral Agreement on Investment, which was taking place in the late 1990s, some negotiations around the expansion of the scope of commitments under the General Agreement on Trade and Services, which is one of the agreements that negotiated in the context of the WTO, which took place in the 2000s, and the EU-US and EU-Canada negotiations that took place in the 2010s, although in the case of CETA, of course, they started earlier. And what we saw there in the context of each of those sets of negotiations is, a number of municipalities, in the latter two cases, hundreds of municipalities passing motions that were quite critical of these agreements and the impacts that these might have on local government autonomy, among other things, right? For example, the ability of local governments to deliver public services, or to pass to conduct public interest decision making without being sued by foreign investors. And so, what we have here is generally social movement organizations preparing a series of templates that are then presented to local councils, and in a number of cases they of course were amended. Some local councils of course didn't pass any motions based on the templates or pass their own motions, but often these motions would then be passed by the councils, and also a number of councils collaborated much more closely with social movement organizations to pass or to issue transnational declarations that were critical of these various agreements. And while, the work we've done so far doesn't allow us to sort of talk at length about the political effects this might have had, I think it's important to stress, that, for social movements and social movement organizations, targeting municipalities was one of the sort of consistent tools they used through different periods of contestation of trade agreements, and was one of the main tools they used together with transnational petitions, notably in the last two episodes I've talked about GATS and TTIP CETA. And, there is a reason to believe that, these sorts of actions would have had some impact. If we look, for example, at the case of Belgium, so Belgium, in Canada, you might know well, is quite known in the context of EU-Canada trade relations, because in the Belgian case, one of the Belgian regions, Wallonia, blocked for a time the signature of the agreement by the Belgian authorities. And so what's interesting to note is that in the Belgian case, of course, in the run-up to this decision, there were quite a few municipalities in southern Belgium and Wallonia that passed critical motions. I think over half passed critical motions, and it's fair to say, I think, that there seems to be at least a correlation there between the position of the Walloon government and the passing of those motions at the municipal level.
So can you speak to the different goals that social movement organizations and municipal governmental actors have, and how each side can overcome misalignment and benefit from collaborating with the other?
Yeah, so I think, as you alluded to, in some ways, this is a puzzling development, right? Because on one hand, municipal governments don't have any say formally over trade policy making, and they're obviously affected by trade policy, but they don't have any say over it. So, as a social movement organization, why would you invest your time and resources into pushing that level of government. And secondly, also, why would you as a municipal government, ultimately you're part of the state, right? Why would you be so responsive to social movement organizations, right? Why would you risk antagonizing the national government, etc.? And so I don't think we have all the answers yet, because it's a big phenomenon and spread across a lot of different countries. But what our research suggests so far is that for social movement organizations, lobbying municipal actors might be actually quite an important part of getting their local activists fired up and actually educating their local activists around issues around trade policy. It also allowed their campaigns to engage in what might be called, this is a term developed by Hobson and Seabrook, mimetic challenge. So in this case, using the discourse of the powerful as comparatively weak actors to challenge policy making, right? So in this case, it's using bureaucratic legal forms and actually using actors of the state to challenge, legalistic texts. And so then turning to local governments, there is a literature, or there is a concept developed by Verhoeven and Duivendijk of what's called governmental activism, which is the idea that local governments ally themselves with social movements to challenge policy making at other levels of government. And because municipalities are affected by trade policy, but don't actually have a formal say, this actually might be a driver of their desire to actually participate or to collaborate with social movement organizations, because they don't have any other avenues open to them, or very few other avenues open to them. Given that their competences are affected, and although the second point I'm going to make now requires, I think, a bit more research, there might also be, intra-party dynamics, right? So it might be about pressuring, where there's a split within a political party on an issue, as indeed there was within the Social Democratic Party in Germany on TTIP and CETA. This might be a way of sort of, for local, politicians to pressure the National Party. And similarly, there might be cases where, let's take the Belgian case, for example, there may have been a desire by, the party that was in opposition at a national level to challenge national level policy making. So the Socialist Party in this case was in government in Wallonia, but in opposition at the national level. Lots of interesting dynamics potentially there.
Okay, and my final question for you. So what is one distinct way you think global trade governance might change in the future? And do you believe that there's a growing pushback on the global aspect of trade?
So, I think now's a really tricky time to hazard a conjecture on this, insofar as we're facing really a time of great socioeconomic upheaval, including, to global trade and investment flows, right? But, obviously I think it would be unfair to end on that. So I'll let me address your question. I think one thing we're already seeing, and we're going to probably see more of, is references to the concept of resilience in the discourse of trade policy actors. But of course, resilience, although it might seem like a sort of term that is invoked by those who want to push for more reshoring, and potentially more protectionist trade and investment policies, is actually very malleable a term. It can mean all sorts of things. It can also mean just diversifying supply chains, for example. So, it isn't just a term that is used to justify protectionism. And so, although there might be some reshoring or some diversifying of supply chains, particularly on certain types of, what are judged to be strategic goods, say medical supplies, I don't think there will necessarily be a wholesale pushback or rejection against globalized trade and investment flows. If we consider, for example, the trade policy of the European Union, its new trade policy mantra is of open strategic autonomy, right? It's been criticized because the term suggests it's trying to please everyone. But I think if you look at the policy documents that have come out of the Commission on this, that so far at least it doesn't seem to represent any market shift away from stressing the benefits of openness and transnational supply chains. But very volatile times, so I may well still be proved wrong.
Okay, so that ends our interview for today, and again, thank you, Professor Siles-Brügge, for joining us.
Thank you very much.